When you think Darwin, this portrait comes to mind. After all, he did publish most of his research when he was older, but today we're going to focus on young Darwin. Back when he was 22, he got invited to travel on the HMS Beagle through South America as a naturalist, and from the data he collected, he built the foundations of his later work, which he would publish 20 years later, The Origin of Species. These books stood the test of time, as its observations of evolution hold true to this day. So, back to 1831. It's the 27th of December, and Darwin sails toward discovery. HMS Beagle set sail on England and traveled near the border of the Mediterranean and northern Africa. They were unable to stop at Madeira Island because of the stormy weather. Not to say Darwin was seasick. Then, as they ventured south, they arrived to the Canary Islands, where they were once again unable to land because there was a cholera pest. The 73 men on board felt defeated, especially Darwin, whose main reason for traveling was to visit the island of Tenerife, his favorite of the Canaries. Further down they reached Santiago, where Darwin observed that shells lined up at the shore, which meant that the sea level changed at some point. Many weeks later, they reached an island in northeastern Brazil, where they rested and then went on to the mainland, which lasted for a couple of months, and this gave Darwin the opportunity to collect specimens and write a lot of his findings. Falkland Island came next, and then they went down to Uruguay. Darwin and the crew traveled through the coastline of Uruguay, Argentina, and Chile, with a special moment in Tierra del Fuego, which is the southernmost part of America, where they met natives. He spent time on the Andes before embarking on the Pacific. They embarked from Lima, Peru, to the very famous Galapagos Island, an archipelago where he collected incredible information that helped his theories. Once they were done there, they went to New Zealand and Australia, outlined southern Africa, and then they went back to South America, and finally the HMS returned to England, where a 27-year-old Darwin was about to make history. The phrase survival of the fittest through natural selection is perhaps the main idea behind evolutionary change. You see, it is thanks to the observable variations that we know that traits are inheritable, which can occur between individuals of the same species or among members of others. It's from variation that the possibility of adaptation arises, thus improving the odds of a species surviving for more generations. Darwin, like many other naturalists, experimented with breeding, which constitutes artificial variation, which can create great diversity, but not necessarily fitness. By comparing his breeding experience with his adaptation knowledge, he noticed that the traits he chose while breeding were not necessarily the most useful in nature. And so, say, a finch or a plant would grow to be very different than that of a natural environment, as the prettiest traits, which were the ones he chose, were most of the time unfavorable to that of the useful. From this, Darwin synthesized his theory of natural selection, which is a mechanism where the environment controls what traits are favored, and so only those who inherit beneficial traits to the environment have a better chance of surviving long enough to reproduce as well. In short, variation leads to adaptation based on the environment, and that affects the overall species over generations. An often misunderstood phrase is survival of the fittest, where fittest means to fit in the environment. This is another way to interpret natural selection, but it's just a general idea as it disregards variation and adaptation. If the environment changes, so will the species, and this will be represented by their numbers and appearance in future generations. Natural selection has brought the hypothesis that all animals have common ancestors. In this context, natural selection is called microevolution. There is evidence that backs up that everything walking on Earth was once swimming, as proven by multiple fossils, one being the Ambulocetus natals, found in 1994, which is also called the walking whale. The great number of fossils have made creationists' claims invalid, as fossils prove that the Earth is more than 6,000 years old, and that the common ancestors are also a thing. Another evidence for evolution is vestigial structures, like the last part of the backbone near the pelvis in humans, which serves no purpose and resembles the structure of a tail, further proving that an ancestor must have had it for us to inherit it. Homologous and analogous structures help differentiate species from common ancestors. For example, the homologous structure is shown as bones or organs that are different between animals but show very common traits anatomically speaking. A couple examples of homologous structures are the human arm bones, which are nearly identical in parts to those of a cat, but they serve differently and have a different movement. Perhaps there seems to be no link between a whale, bats, cats, and humans, but the bat wings and whale fins are structurally compatible to ours, and so we know that we share a common ancestor. Analogous structures are structures which have the same function but are said to evolve independently, as their origin is different and so is their ancestor. Let's take, for example, once again the bat, which has wings held by bones. And let's take a butterfly, which has wings made of membranes. They do the same thing, fly, but they differ in structure. Before ending, here are three types of natural selection that statistically affect normal distribution, also known as the bell curve. Directional selection shows an abrupt change in a phenotype trait, which shows that a trait was very necessary for the survival of the species as a whole. Take for example bacteria, which have to evolve faster in order to defeat current antibiotics. Stabilizing selection, also understood as predator selective pressure, manifests where any of the extremes in phenotypes are not favorable for the survival of the species. The last is disruptive selection, where both extremes are equally favored, as in bird populations where male counterparts are competitive when it comes to mating, causing them to be aggressive against bird types that are not as dominant as they are. Say a dominant phenotype of a bird, which is much more likely to reproduce, has to beware of other birds, which may steal their mate, but they disregard those they see as weak, which ironically enough, because they're left alone, they have little trouble mating. And so these are the general ideas that Darwin held and have made him stood the test of time. One of Darwin's observations in Galapagos was that there were many types of finches and many types of tortoises. When it comes to the tortoises, you can notice that in some islands they have long necks and long legs. This is because the food they want to consume, plants, are much taller, so they have adapted, and in some islands the tortoises have longer necks. In other islands, plants are low, there's grass, anything they need is down there, so all they need is short necks and short legs. When it comes to the finches, some areas had hard-shelled nuts, which they needed strong beaks for them, and in other areas there was much more fruit than seeds, which led to different beaks in different islands.